Okay.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, was established in 2008 as one of the mandated aspects of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. In Canadian law, the term Indian refers to persons who are Inuit, Métis, or First Nations. The Indian residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to facilitate the rapid assimilation of Indigenous people into Canadian culture. They existed prior to Confederation. The first such school on record is the Mohawk Institute Residential School, established in Brantford, Ontario in 1828. The last residential school to close was the Gordon Institute Residential School in Punick, Saskatchewan in 1996. Canadian Confederation occurred in 1867 with the British North America Act. Section 91, subsection 24 of the BNA Act gave the Canadian government, the Canadian federal government, jurisdiction or control over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. The Indian Act, an amendment to the BNA Act in 1876, resulted in the appointment of a Minister of Indian Affairs who had representatives for every reserved land and the Indigenous people who lived on the land across Canada. The Indian agent had absolute control over the reserves and the Indigenous people who lived on them. In 1884, attendance at residential schools became compulsory for every Indigenous child in Canada. This was enforced by the Indian agents with the assistance of police and priests. Any Indigenous parents who attempted to withhold their children from attending or resisted the forced taking of their children, some of whom were as young as 4 years old, were threatened with prison sentences. Indigenous parents were often not told to which school their children were being sent. Few parents could afford the transportation costs of bringing their children home during breaks in the academic year. So numerous children were away from their families and homes for up to a decade. The list of official residential schools includes 140 schools in 7 provinces and 3 territories across Canada. The official number of Indigenous children who attended residential schools is approximately 150,000. This does not include the number of children and their records that disappeared while at residential school, nor the school records that were lost or destroyed. The exact number of Indigenous children who died due to prolonged malnutrition, severe physical abuse, or disease while attending residential schools cannot be known. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was mandated to reveal to Canadians the complex truth about the history and ongoing legacy of the church-run residential schools in a manner that fully documents the individual and collective harms perpetrated against Aboriginal peoples and honors the resilience and courage of former students, their families, and communities. The final report of the TRC was released in 2015. The report is based on the personal testimonies of residential school survivors, their family members, and primary source research undertaken by the TRC. The Commission heard first-hand testimonies of approximately 9,000 residential school survivors who had registered at national events. Many survivors attended the events but did not register. The Commission also held 238 days of local hearings in 77 communities across the country, including correctional institutions. Many survivors could not attend or participate in the events due to the ongoing effects of the trauma they suffered while attending residential school, let alone be able to speak about their experiences in these public events. This process was the first time that the voices of the people who attended residential schools were officially heard and became part of the historical record. When the TRC ended, the Commission formulated 94 calls to action in response to their findings. The calls to action are intended to address the legacy of the residential schools' impact on the lived experience of Indigenous peoples, as well as the continued impact of residential school system on Canadian society and on the perception of Canadian history.